All right, man, peace. So, brothers, this video right here is going to be the post-fight coverage of the very good welterweight championship match that occurred this past Saturday night between Mr. Terence "Bud" Crawford and Mr. Shawn "Showtime" Porter. Let me first congratulate both fighters for putting forth their best effort. Once again, Terence "Bud" Crawford showed why he's the class not only of his division, but most likely the class of boxing. As I've said for a very long time now, I've battled between who I would consider the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport, whether it be Terence Crawford or Canelo. One can certainly make a great case for either fighter. I think that overall, Mr. Canelo Alvarez has earned the top spot because of what he's been able to accomplish and many of the big names that he's been in the ring with. But beyond a shadow of a doubt, the eye test tells us that Terence "Bud" Crawford is the best fighter in the sport, no doubt about it, because he can do things that even Canelo can't do. I would give Canelo an edge defensively, but I would give Terence Crawford a huge edge when it comes to footwork. And I stated, in my pre-fight review that the one thing that I'll be watching for is whether or not Terence "Bud" Crawford was still relatively light on his feet. And he showed me that he was. I did say that I was not going to take his performance against Kell Brook too seriously because he was very stationary in that fight. I believe that he came into that bout with an aggressive mentality and aggressive approach because he knew that Kell Brook was a fighter who pretty much was on the other side of it, had been through a series of wars, especially against Triple G and against Errol Spence, and he was a fighter who could be broken down early in the fight, even though he was still dangerous. I actually thought that Kell Brook hurt Terence Crawford more in their 2 or 3 rounds of fighting than Shawn Porter did for the entire fight. Not to say that Shawn did not land any, necessarily hard or consequential blows, but Shawn has always had an issue with punch execution, proper punch execution. Shawn is one of these guys who's gotten very far in this sport, strangely enough, without properly learning how to throw a blow. He's never truly learned how to throw a proper punch. And one of the main reasons for that is his trainer, Kenny Porter, but I'll be getting back to that later on in this video. Shawn is someone who, you have to give him a lot of credit. He's like, one of those little great engines that could. He reminds me almost like a boxing version of Kyler Murray. If you squint, you can convince yourself that maybe he could be elite. But you come to terms with the fact that some of his deficiencies are going to stop him from ever truly being elite, like a Kyler Murray. And some brothers out there might be Kyler Murray fans, and they're saying to themselves, what are you talking about? Kyler Murray, if he hadn't gotten hurt, would be the runaway favorite, or at the very least the favorite for this year's NFL MVP. I think that you're going to find in the playoffs, when he comes against real defenses who have the opportunity and the time to game plan against him, that they're going to be able to marginalize many of the dangers that he brings to the table. He's a great thrower of the football, but he's so short. He almost always has to navigate outside of the pocket. And in the same way, Mr. Shawn Porter, because of the fact that he has not been blessed or gifted bodily to be a success in the ring against elite fighters, he's always going to come up short in the biggest fights. Because he's very short for the weight class. He has very short arms for the weight class. And the only way that you can make up for those type of deficiencies is if you're exceedingly blessed in other ways. See a Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez does not have anywhere near the feet of a Shawn Porter. He's nowhere near the natural athlete of a Shawn Porter. But even though Canelo lacks stature and arm reach for the divisions that he competes in, he makes up for it by having an exceedingly great boxing skill set, tremendous defense, and unbelievable power for whatever weight class that he's in. His power has been able to travel up through the weight classes for whatever reason. I'm not going to get too much into that right now, but we know some of the things that have been alleged and proven about Canelo. I'll leave it at that. Either way, the cat is very gifted when it comes to power. He just is. And Shawn doesn't have that. In order for you to be so much smaller in stature than your opponents when it comes to height and reach, you have to have a non-pareil skill set, or you have to be exceedingly blessed. Shawn isn't. So he has a ceiling, and this last fight against Terence Crawford has solidified it for him, that he's never going to beat the cream of the crop in that weight class. So Mr. Shawn Porter decided that he was going to announce his retirement, and let me congratulate him. There's a great nobility in knowing when something is over. There's a great nobility and honor in knowing when something is over, whether it be a time period in your life pertaining to a relationship with a significant other, with a friend, with a job, or what have you. Everything has an ending date. Accept it. And I'm very happy for Shawn Porter that he was able to understand that there is no need for him to continue to compete in boxing, especially when he has so many other skills that he can show the world. He's a great speaker. Shawn Porter is someone who, when he speaks, you believe what he says. Is he on the level of an Andre Ward? Is his brain as sharp as an Andre Ward's? Absolutely not. But Shawn Porter's gift is that when he speaks, you believe that he believes everything that he says. And he's very likable. So that will go a long way with him. Boxing commentating is something that he can do if he wants to for the next 25, 30 years. So kudos to him once again for understanding that his time period in boxing is over. He's boxed most of the big names. He's beaten everyone that he should have beat. He's also lost to many of the fighters that he was supposed to lose to. And every once in a while, he beat a fighter that he was supposed to lose to. So I give the brother credit. Do I think that he's a Hall of Famer? I would put him in, but others might not. To me, he's been able to be successful enough as a welterweight that he would deserve to go into the Hall of Fame. You know, boxers like him, Paulie Malignaggi, I would put Paulie in the Hall of Fame also. Not to digress too much. I put Paulie in because Paulie's a multiple weight champion. And for a fighter who, you know, for the most part, was very limited in the things that he could do, for Malignaggi to be able to find a way to win major belts at multiple weight classes, he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. And in my view, Malignaggi, he would be on his way to being in the Hall of Fame as an announcer had he not been caught up in the woke reckoning of 2020. But just to get back to the fight, I thought that Shawn Porter performed very well earlier on in the fight, but one could see how the fight was going to go if Shawn was unable to hurt Terence, which he was unable to do. It was very obvious that the game plan, particularly for Terence Crawford, was pretty much what I said it was going to be. Just be you. When Shawn Porter dives in with his chin in the air, throwing those wild, wide hooks, just take a step back and fire off that counter uppercut or those counter hooks. You're going to catch him eventually. Now, don't get it twisted. Terence had a relatively difficult go of it, approximating the appropriate timing for his counters in the first 5 rounds. And after 5 rounds, I added Shawn Porter 4 rounds to 1. And at first I said, maybe I'm bugging. Maybe, one of those rounds I should give to Terence Crawford. But then I saw Mr. Andre Ward's scorecard, and it coincided with mine. So I said, okay, cool, I'm not bugging. He's seeing the same thing that I'm seeing. Andre Ward is seeing the same thing that I'm seeing. So I said, okay. But I did have Shawn Porter up 4 rounds to 1 after 5 rounds. And then Terence Crawford systematically started to take over the fight pretty much from round 6 to the end. Maybe Shawn may have won 1 round after round 5, maybe. But I just thought that Terence Crawford was easily the more dominant fighter from the 6th round through the 10th round when the stoppage finally occurred. And I thought that Terence, he showed pretty much everything that he normally shows. I will say this. I did notice him breathing hard multiple times throughout the fight. I'm not going to necessarily say that it's due to age or him advancing in years as a fighter, because Shawn Porter, he does up the pace of the fight. Shawn Porter is not going to be a fighter or an opposition that you'll be able to rest for too many rounds over the course of the fight, because he's always going to keep you on edge. He's in great condition. He's very strong, and you never know when he's going to try his attacks. Now, Shawn is very limited when it comes to his skill set. We know that, he views a feint as basically stomping on the floor. Like, to Shawn Porter, that's a feint. That's why I state that he probably could have been a greater fighter had he had a real trainer. His father's not a real trainer. Even though Kenny Porter, if you let Kenny Porter tell it, he's trained every U.S. amateur boxer who's come through that program since 2004. And he's the reason why, that fighter is who he is today. Oh, yeah, I trained Errol. Yeah, I trained Errol. I took him to the Pan Am Games. Oh, yeah, Bud. I was his coach when he won the medal in Russia. Yeah, that was me. Like, Kenny Porter's that guy who, he's almost like a black Al Bundy. He scored 4 touchdowns in a single game back in high school, and he can't stop telling you about it. But once again, I'm going to get to Kenny at the end of this video, or near the end. because there was a bit of controversy pertaining to Kenny Porter and his statements about his son in the post-fight interview that I definitely want to address. But just getting back to the fight, I thought that Bud did a very good job. He had a very educated jab. You know, when he turns southpaw, he's relatively exemplary, and he's yet to face an opponent who actually has the skill set to be able to nullify many of the things that he wants to do. I mean, to be quite honest with you, when I look across the landscape, the terrain of the welterweight division, I don't see a fighter with all of the attributes that it would take to defeat a Terence Crawford right now. I gave Errol Spence more of a chance. I probably would have favored Errol Spence before the car crash, like 51-49 or 52% to 48%. But right now, the Errol Spence that I've seen post-car crash, number one, I was not that impressed with his performance against Danny Garcia. I thought that that fight was much closer than, the commentary would have the viewing audience believe. I had Errol winning that fight against Danny Garcia 7-5. I thought that he started to waver and weaken down the course of that fight. Now, of course, one can say that was his first fight back. I also thought that, however he trained, maybe he overtrained for the fight, because he did appear to be a bit emaciated in the ring that night, not fully having the musculature that we were accustomed to from an Errol Spence. And maybe he overtrained. Who knows? I'm not going to make too many excuses for Errol Spence. Either way, he is going to have to face his day of reckoning against Terence Bud Crawford. If they were to fight tomorrow, I would favor Bud. Probably 60-65% for Bud to 40-35% for Errol Spence. But who knows? Maybe Errol will have a sparkling performance, a superlative performance in his next fight. Assuming that it's not going to be Bud, I don't see him getting into the ring next against a Bud Crawford. I would assume that Mr. Errol Spence will try to maybe have a warm-up fight, and he might consider that warm-up fight to be Yordenis Ugas for his belt. And then we'll see what happens, because that would give Bud 3 belts. It would give Terence Crawford 1 belt. And it would allow for Errol Spence to negotiate as the A side. Now, there are some other problems with that, because Terence Crawford, he is a quote-unquote alpha, as they say. So it would therefore be very difficult for Bud to concede that Errol Spence deserves more money than him, because he's accomplished more at welterweight. If you listen to Terence's post-fight press conference, he was talking about so many of the accolades that he's been able to attain, and so many of the achievements that he's been able to garner over the course of his boxing career, and how he feels like Errol Spence's achievements pale in comparison. So already he's letting you know that he's not willing to enter into that fight as the quote-unquote B-side. So that's why I think that Errol Spence and his team, the PBC, they would be doing themselves a great favor if they were to make Errol's next fight against Yordenis Ugas. And should Errol be victorious, which is not a guarantee, he would have 3 belts to bring into the negotiations. That would be a major boon for him, because these guys are going to have to fight. They're both trying to act like they have so many options. They really don't. Terence is talking about moving up to 154. At the end of the day, the brother's 33, 34 years old. He might have 4 big fights left in him. I think that he should want to make that Errol Spence fight for the sake of his legacy. I think that, were he to get into the ring with an Errol Spence and be victorious, it would cement his time period and his legacy as arguably the best fighter of the late 2010s, early 2020s. He would have his name in there. Now, of course, most would say Canelo. But at the very least, fans who are knowledgeable, or viewers who are knowledgeable of the sport of boxing, would say that, Canelo was the popular champ, but, Terence Crawford was the boxing aficionados champ. At least he would have a stake there. So it's very important for his legacy. It was also good that he finally came to the understanding that he does not need Bob Arum. And this is what I try to communicate to you so-called black men all the time. Once you get to a certain level, a certain status, you're supposed to understand that your time and your gifts are supposed to equate to money. Money's earned. And the best way for Terence Crawford to maximize his earning potential is to be a free agent. His name is so large now, there's no need for him to fall up under a promotional banner. Bob Arum has tried to convince Terence Crawford, like a pimp does a hoe, that you need me and that I'm actually losing money because of you, which could be true, who knows? But if Bob Arum is losing money, it's because of his bad promotional tactics, not because of anything that Terence Crawford is not doing, because he's a very exciting fighter to watch. Now, is he anywhere near as charismatic as a Floyd Mayweather? Absolutely not. But keep in mind that Bob Arum had no idea how to market Floyd Mayweather either. And Floyd Mayweather is one of these sparkling sports personalities of the last 20, 30 years. And most did not understand that until Floyd went out on his own and pretty much was the person who created the concept of 24/7, which has now become the go-to mechanism to market fighters, are these reality shows. That was started by Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather came up with the idea of a boxing reality show to cover these fighters. Now, of course, we know that there was the boxing show with Sugar Ray Leonard, The Contender, before that. But that was for boxers who, were trying to get their name out there. Floyd Mayweather was the person that came up with the idea for a boxing reality show to market, fighters who were real fighters, who were champions. So Floyd has always had a bunch of ideas. Bob, I think, was threatened, as most people are threatened, by a so-called black man who takes control over his own life. People have this incessant belief, for whatever reason, that every time a so-called black man is talented, that he owes them his talent for free. Floyd Mayweather has the mentality that, no, I don't owe you my talent for free. Time equals money, and work equals time, so work equals money. You must pay me. And once again, I hope that all of you so-called black men advance to that level of thought. Once you do that, a lot of the shackles will start to fall off of you. Because we're in the time right now where brothers have the opportunity to show their gifts in a way that they never had before. But just to get back to the point, Mr. Terence Bud Crawford has finally thrown off those shackles. I wish that he had done that 3 or 4 years ago. Had he done that, we may have seen the Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence fight already. In the same way that for years, Floyd Mayweather told Manny Pacquiao, you have to be your own boss. And it wasn't until Manny Pacquiao left Bob Arum, after years of Floyd Mayweather saying that Bob Arum is stopping the fight, that we finally saw the Manny Pacquiao versus Floyd Mayweather fight happen, because they were able to negotiate with each other. And just like that, the fight got made. Bob Arum has always been the main inhibitor of these major fights between promotional companies, because he's someone who believes that he should get all the money. You understand that? And he did not like the business paradigm of the PBC. You can make these fights happen, but both fighters have to have a self-starter, persona or personality, where they want to control, what's happening in their careers once they get big enough. And I'm not trying to absolve the PBC of any culpability, because they be on their bullshit as well. Don't get it twisted. But at the end of the day, it takes two to tango. So either way, I do believe that this fight is going to get made between Terence Crawford and Errol Spence. It really has to, for the sake of both of their legacies. And, for the sake of both fighters having a defining fight for their careers. Neither one of them are getting any younger. I think that people forget Terence Crawford is in his mid-30s, early to mid-30s. Errol Spence is in his early 30s. These guys are not 24 and 25-year-old kids anymore. They're not prospects. These big fights have to happen right now. But just getting back to the fight that happened last Saturday night, I thought that Bud showed great patience. He showed great craft, as usual. It will be interesting, if that fight between Bud and Errol Spence does happen. Does Bud decide to turn southpaw against a southpaw in Errol Spence? Because if he were to decide to do so, he'd be nullifying a lot of the advantages that he has when he turns southpaw against orthodox fighters. And if he does turn southpaw, will Errol Spence show enough craft and enough boxing wisdom, to take advantage of, Bud Crawford deciding to turn southpaw on him? Errol's going to have to be faster and crisper than he's ever been to defeat a Bud Crawford. He's going to have to catch him with sharp punches, not just hard punches, but sharp punches. which is something that Shawn Porter was unable to do. Shawn tried his hardest, but you could just see he didn't have the craft. Shawn is a very short fighter who fights like a tall fighter, and that's why I blame his father for that. His father never taught him how to utilize his lack of height. Shawn really should have embraced a style similar to a Smoking Joe Frazier, or a small fighter who tried to make himself even more elusive through a lot of waist movement. Shawn doesn't do that. Shawn is very upright and very stiff for a short fighter. And he has very little idea how to get on the inside without taking punishment. And that's why he took so much punishment trying to come inside on Bud. And after round 5, Bud just kept catching him with left hands to the body. There were multiple times, even before the stoppage, where you could see that Bud had caught him so authoritatively with the left to the body that it literally stopped Shawn in his tracks. There were a couple of rounds where Shawn tried to bum rush him, and Bud stepped back and wound up and hit him with a hard left uppercut or straight left to the body. And Shawn literally froze and just stood there. And Bud froze and looked at him like, yes, nigga, I know that you felt that. I'm not even going to follow up. I'm just going to look at you because I know that you know that you're hurt. So I'm just going to let that shot marinate right now. That happened at least twice in that fight. That Bud hit him that hard and just let him stand there and act like he wasn't hurt. But anybody who's been hit with a hard body shot understands that you have to be in immaculate condition to not go down when a body shot lands perfect to the solar plexus or to the liver. So kudos to Shawn for not going down. But in the 10th round, when Bud caught him with those, with those counters or with those left uppercuts, as Shawn was trying to dive in, that was all she wrote. And I did tell you, brothers, coming into the fight in my preview video, that it would not surprise me if Terence Crawford knocked him down twice, which is what happened. It's not that difficult to see how these fights are going to go once you understand styles and you understand the craft of the sport. Boxing is a skill game. It's not about who's stronger or who has bigger muscles. It's really not about that at all. It's about who's in better condition and who understands the sport better. But let me also say this. Muscles don't equate to strength. And there's a difference between fitness and condition. Am I saying that Shawn Porter was not in condition? No, he was in great condition. He's just not as naturally strong as Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford is, supernaturally strong. There was a portion in the fight, there was a moment in the fight where Shawn tried to bully Terence. He tried to clinch him and walk him to the middle of the ring. And Terence Crawford literally moved Shawn all the way to the ropes. And you can see the look on Shawn's face like, what the hell is this? It was very similar to the Floyd Mayweather versus Shane Mosley fight, where Shane tried to do the same thing to Floyd. And Floyd grabbed Shane and just started walking him, and you can see the look on Shane's face like, wow, this guy is super strong. He's way stronger than I thought, and he's stronger than me. And I believe that when Shawn Porter saw that, he said to himself, wow, I'm not going to be able to bully this guy, so how am I going to win unless I get fortunate enough to land the perfect blow? And Shawn does not have enough natural power to do anything with Terence Crawford unless he just catches him with the perfect shot, which he wasn't going to do. That's why I agreed with the stoppage. I had no problem with the stoppage that Kenny Porter executed down the stretch of that fight last Saturday night, because his son was going to take irreparable damage had he allowed that fight to continue. Shawn was not going to hurt Terence anymore. He was not going to do anything of consequence to Terence Crawford after those 2 knockdowns. All that was going to happen was that Shawn was going to get his brains scrambled. Kenny Porter did the right thing by his son. So now that provides the perfect segue to speak about Mr. Kenny Porter, who caused a bit of a hullabaloo in the aftermath of the fight on Saturday night by stating in the post-fight interview or in the post-fight presser after the fight that he believed that his son was not properly prepared for the fight. And many of the members of the media jumped on him because they believed that he was trying to disrespect his son, or he was showing disregard for how serious his son takes the sport. And at first, I agreed with that sentiment, that this was another case of Kenny Porter trying to absolve himself of any culpability when it comes to his son's performance. But what I realized was and this is just my view of it, it's very obvious that Kenny Porter simply chose the wrong choice of words. When he said that his son was not prepared, or he did not prepare properly for the fight, he was talking about mentally, not physically. His son was running the miles. He was doing the sparring and the bag work and the calisthenics and lifting the weights. But mentally, he did not have the proper approach for the fight. And he was putting on a facade for his opponent and for the viewer. He came into the ring with the Marvin Hagler robe on and all these other things. And, I mean, look, no disrespect to Shawn Porter. Shawn Porter, on his best day, could never approximate Marvelous Marvin Hagler. He was nowhere near the boxer. And when I say he, I'm talking about Shawn Porter. Shawn Porter was, and I say in past tense was because he's now retired, Shawn Porter was nowhere near the skilled craftsman of a Marvin Hagler, not even going into the unbelievable power that Marvin Hagler possessed. Marvin Hagler at 160 had the punching power of a light heavyweight. Now, was his power as electric necessarily as a Thomas Hearns when it comes to one-punch power? Not necessarily, but it was damn near there, and he had the thudding power to go along with it. So when Marvin Hagler spoke about being ready to go to war, that's actually what he was prepping himself to do. Shawn Porter was just talking. And I believe that Kenny Porter is intelligent enough to know that boxing is not a sport that you can afford to put forth these veneers and these facades about what you're going to do when you're entering into the ring against trained killers. Because, that's what Terence Crawford is. He's a trained killer, hand-to-hand combat. Terence is not in there to play with you. Terence is a trained killer. If you watch the pre-fight press conference, when Terence Crawford and Shawn Porter were on stage, Shawn Porter was there with his little son, and Terence Crawford was, making faces and playing around with Shawn Porter's son, looking at him from across, the dais or across the stage per se, while also knowing in his mind that if need be, I will put your father into such a compromised state health-wise that I won't care about him when I'm in that ring with him, but I can still joke around with you. That's the level of detachment that you have to have as an elite level fighter. That you can be my friend, but if you come into the ring with me, if I have to kill you in self-defense, I will. You understand that? So they're a whole different breed, and Kenny Porter understood that. That's why he stopped the fight, and thankfully he did. I saw a lot of people saying, well, Shawn was still in the fight. Yeah, Shawn was still in the fight, but he wasn't going to win that fight. He was not going to win that fight, and I get it. The scorecards were close. I get it. But Terence Crawford was about to put a hellified ass whooping on that man for the last 2.5 rounds of that fight. And I think that Kenny Porter knew that Shawn was at his end as a fighter. Fathers know. And he was not going to, it was not going to happen on his watch that his son was going to become, a tomato can and not be able to, really be a father to his own children. So kudos to Kenny Porter. The only thing that I'll blame him for is using the wrong choice of words after the fight when he talked about preparation. He should have said, I did not feel that my son was mentally all there during our training. Now, of course, that's still an excuse, but if that's how he feels, that's how he feels. Many people are very, very critical of Kenny Porter because he comes across as a guy who wants all of the attention for himself, and I understand that because he clearly has a very huge ego, as most boxing fathers have. Floyd Mayweather's dad, Roy Jones's dad, Shane Mosley's dad, the list goes on and on. Vasily Lomachenko's dad, all these guys. Teofimo Lopez's dad, Devin Haney's dad. Boxing is a sport of dads and sons. And the dad, many times, he's so proud of what he's been able to make his son into because boxing, more than any sport other than MMA and football, is really a personification and a manifestation of manhood and masculinity. I'm going to go to war with this other person, and either I'm going to take away his consciousness or he's going to take away mine. So, boxing is one of the last bastions of unrepentant masculinity. So, of course, it's going to be a sport of fathers and sons. So many times the father, he lives his life through the son. Now, we'll say this. Shawn Porter, I think that he's neglected. And of course, I'm just saying this as an outsider. But I think that he's neglected having that moment with his dad to help him understand. And this happens a lot, especially if you have dads who have a quote-unquote alpha mentality. And you yourself have a quote-unquote alpha mentality. There comes a point in your life as a young man that you have to help your father understand that you're no longer the authoritarian in my life. Now you're the counselor. You're the advisor. You're not the authoritarian. And a great film that showed that was the movie The Godfather, where over the course of the film, and I do have to review that film on my Chronicles of Judah channel. Over the course of that film, we see the transitioning of the relationship between Michael Corleone and his father Vito, from Vito being the authoritarian to Vito being the counselor. The father has to learn that now, I must give over my powers to my son. And I think that Shawn has resisted helping his father understand what his role is now. And I think that it's resulted in certain things. Now, hopefully they never have a huge blow up where their relationship is dissolved. But I think that Kenny has become so comfortable being the autocrat over the Porter clan that sometimes he oversteps his bounds when it comes to how he speaks about his son. He still talks about his son like he's a little boy. But, all in all, Kenny Porter is a protector. So there's only so much that I'm going to say about Kenny Porter. I do think that he made the right decision. Do I think that he oversteps his bounds sometimes? Sure. But that's an issue for he and his son to handle. Because at the end of the day, if we had more overprotective dads in the so-called black community, we'd be far better off than what we have right now. But just getting back to the fight overall, very good fight. Definitely not the best Shawn Porter fight. The best Shawn Porter fight that I can remember seeing was probably his bout with Keith Thurman, and also, of course, Errol Spence. Those were the two best Shawn Porter fights. This one was okay. But this was very important for Terence to show that he can have fights made with the PBC guys, and he's right there with the PBC guys, even though, let's be for real, Shawn Porter is an intro. But at this point in so many of these guys' careers, is Keith Thurman the guy that he was back in 2016 when he fought Shawn Porter? No, that was 5 years ago. Keith is not the same guy. We saw Keith almost get stopped by Riverside Rocky when he came back from one of his injuries. So Keith is not the same guy. Danny Garcia, to me, is right behind Shawn Porter. Danny Garcia is, one big fight and one big loss away from retiring himself. If you follow Danny on IG, all he does is a bunch of Scarface impersonations and show off the real estate that he's acquired. So he has one foot out of boxing, and that's good. Because Danny's another guy that I don't want to see at 154. He's not going to have any success up there. He's too short, his hands are too slow, his feet are too slow, and his arms are too short. So Danny is another guy who I could see is on his way out. Now, when it comes to Keith one-time Thurman, I'm not quite sure about Keith. I'm not quite sure where his mind is at right now. Keith is another guy who'd make a great boxing announcer. So he has options. Whenever fighters start to have options, that means that they should start considering exiting the sport, because boxing is a sport where you have to be all in, absolutely all the way in. If you're just 99% in, if you get into the ring against a fighter who's dedicated and focused enough, you're going to get knocked out and maybe badly hurt. But could Keith possibly be fighting a Yordenis Ugas next? Who knows? I haven't heard anything about Errol Spence and who he might fight next. Of course, we know that Bob wants Terence Crawford to fight, this kid Josh Taylor, who's undisputed at 140. A lot of the European dudes, are trying to champion Josh Taylor. A lot of these guys try to give me a hard time because supposedly I give the European fighters the short end of the stick. I have nothing against European fighters. European fighters will tell you themselves that they don't think that they've made it unless they've come to America and showed out in America. That's the fact of the matter. And I have the same attitude. America has the best athletes in the world and the best boxers in the world. That's why boxers from overseas come to America to prove that they're the best. Because they know that America has the best. It's not nationalism at all. It's just fact. Ask any foreign boxer When do they think that they've made it? They're going to say, when I fought in Las Vegas for a world championship. Las Vegas is the mecca of boxing. That's what it's considered. So nothing against European fighters, right? But everybody knows what the view is of foreign fighters. Foreigners have to come to America to prove themselves, period. So we're going to see about Josh Taylor. Josh Taylor is a very good fighter. Do I think that he has anything for Terence Crawford? No, I don't. I think that if he fought Terence Crawford, he'd probably get stopped in 8 rounds. Nothing against him. He looks like a nice fighter. Saw him fight Prograis, you know, but I don't see him against Terence Crawford doing anything against him. But we'll see. We'll find out. Josh Taylor is a guy who has a lot of tricks in his bag. Maybe he'll be able to catch Terence with something if they fight. I doubt it, but we'll see. But anyway, congratulations to Terence Bud Crawford. I've pretty much covered everything that I wanted to cover. Also, congratulations to Mr. Shawn Porter. He's had a hell of a career. I remember the first time seeing Shawn Porter was in Elie Seckbach's videos 12, 13 years ago when he was Pacquiao's sparring partner. You know, they used to have a lot of great fighters at the Wild Card Gym ran by Freddie Roach, Manny Pacquiao's trainer, back in the day that Elie Seckbach used to interview back in the late 2000s. I remember seeing Jose Benavidez, his brother David Benavidez, back when David was just a little short, fat kid with an afro. I remember seeing them. I remember Elie Seckbach, he was the first guy to interview Danny Garcia even before he fought Amir Khan. I remember seeing Guillermo Rigondeaux at the Wild Card Gym back then. And also, of course, Shawn Showtime Porter. So Shawn has come a long way. Shawn has come a long way. I mean, he's one of the best football players to ever box. I'll give him that. Him, Ken Norton, some of the best football players that I've seen become boxers. You can always tell football players because they're very stiff. Seth Mitchell was a football player who tried to become a champ. The PBC tried to build him up, and he couldn't box at all. He was just a big, slow football player. But Shawn Porter was able to create a great career for himself. So kudos to him. Kudos to his retirement. He has a beautiful family, father who loves him. So congratulations to him. Terence Crawford, the sky is the limit, but he also has to understand that he's at that very important place that athletes get to, where they're at the pinnacle. Like right now, he's at the mountaintop at 33 years old, 32, 33, maybe 34. You're at the pinnacle of the mountain, and then right after that, you start to decline. So that's why I say that Terence might have 4 big fights left in him, where he's still a great fighter. And that depends on how many fights he has in a year. Because once again, I'm not going to make too much of it, but I did notice him breathing hard in that, in that Shawn Porter fight. And again, it could be because of the pressure that Shawn puts on you, but it also could be a bit because of age. I don't care who Terence fights next, but I would love to see him fight Errol Spence within the next 2 fights. I also wouldn't mind seeing Terence possibly taking on this fighter, Josh Taylor, the undisputed 140-pound junior welterweight champion, just so that I could evaluate or guesstimate exactly how good this guy is while watching him go against who I view to be the best fighter in the sport overall. And yes, I do have Terence Bud Crawford as the best fighter in the sport when it comes to eye test and skill set. But I proudly have Canelo Alvarez as my #1 pound-for-pound fighter because of his achievements and his accomplishments. But anyway, congratulations to both fighters. Peace.